The last section of ecology notes is on conservation of biodiversity and sustainability of ecosystems. We already know that conserving biodiversity is incredibly important, as the more biodiverse an ecosystem is, the more stable it would be considered to be, the more sustainable in the long run. And so typically there are several approaches that would need to be done in order to conserve biodiversity in a particular area. It's typically not one approach that will be enough. You'll need several approaches to be able to tackle this biodiversity crisis. Any and all strategies that are considered helpful should be used. Some of the methods that we will use are called in situ or ex situ conservation efforts. These are a little bit different. In situ means that organisms remain on site. So a good example of an in situ conservation method would be like a nature reserve, because you don't physically remove the organisms from their original habitat. They tend to do a better job of being able to make a comeback if they do remain in their initial habitat, because that's what they're used to, and they can continue to interact with other native species. That doesn't mean, however, that we don't have to help. Putting in a boundary and saying this is a nature reserve is not always enough. Sometimes it will require what's called active management, which is when humans do have to come in and actively help restore this ecosystem to a higher level of biodiversity. Many things are listed here, but we could help control grazing. So that means we could make sure that we have the right number of grazers to be able to come in and graze the area, graze the grasses. We could help like mow the grasses if we had to, if there weren't enough native grazers and having too many grasses was a problem. We could remove trees and shrubs that are blocking light to layers below, or that potentially are not providing any benefit to that ecosystem. We definitely would want to try and remove alien plant species so that they don't become invasive, or if they're already invasive, again, we definitely want to try and get rid of those because they tend to take over an ecosystem. The same for invasive animals. It says culling of invasive animals. That means killing the invasive animals. So remove them and probably kill them. Reintroduction of locally extinct species. So if there used to be species there that are no longer present in that area, but there are populations elsewhere, we could take from the other populations that are more stable and then reintroduce them carefully into this particular area. Re-wetting of the wetlands. We already know that we've drained a lot of wetlands, and that drainage has caused major ecosystem collapses. So by removing the drainage systems or re-wetting them is helpful. Limiting predators. If there are too many predators and that affects the prey and the trophic levels below that, then we may have to go in and control some of that. Controlling poaching. We have laws in place that hopefully will help control poaching, which is illegal hunting. We need, the rangers to be out there enforcing these laws as well. Feeding the animals if there's not enough food currently in that ecosystem may be needed. And then limiting the access, choosing who can go in and out, or a certain number of people going in and out, or perhaps it has to be so protected that nobody goes in and out. Controlling access is definitely important. Here shows you our Channel Islands, just right off our coastline. And many of our Channel Islands do have protective areas where you can see there are conservation areas there. Just because there are conservation areas there does not mean that every single organism there is off limits for fishing or catching or something like that. It really depends on what's going on in that ecosystem at that time. But there are still regulations, and so when you go to these areas, you would need to know what these regulations were. And there's always going to be signs posted, laws posted, so that you know what is versus what is not allowed in each of those particular areas. For example, maybe you can harvest lobsters, but you might have to do it within specific parameters. So in this location, during this season, you can only take this many per day. They have to be this size or over this size, things like that. A lot of times too, these reserves will be protected in such a way that you can't remove anything from them. Like Satwiwa, for example, and I know for sure in one of the islands too, I think it's Santa Cruz, there are places where you can't even take a rock away from that ecosystem. And this is really for the protection of both ecosystems, like wherever you would be taking it to, as well as the one you're taking it from, because that rock could be important to an organism that lives there. But in addition to that, that rock could have microorganisms on it that you can't see. And then you take those microorganisms to a new location, put the rock down, and then that could potentially spread disease or other complications to that ecosystem. So again, it's just important for you to be aware, know the laws, know what's allowed, know what's not allowed, and then just be responsible. Ex-situ conservation methods are different because this time organisms are taken off-site. Ex-situ means off-site. So that means they will be removed from their normal original habitat and taken to a different location for restoration purposes. These are typically used as a backup when in-situ conservation measures are not working appropriately or not helping, or if it's not safe for an organism that is endangered to stay there until they have higher numbers, we might have to remove them and breed them in an off-site location and then reintroduce them back into their native habitat later. And there's a lot of methods to do ex-situ conservation methods also. So one, plant species can be grown in botanic gardens. Like if you've ever been to a Huntington library, there's a lot, that's a really huge botanical garden. We have some smaller ones here in Thousand Oaks too as well that you can go to, but that's what they do. They grow plants, usually native plants, and then hopefully get the seeds from those plants or even transplant smaller plants back to their natural habitat, kind of help conserve biodiversity that way. We can also store seeds for long periods of time in what's called a seed bank. That's shown in this picture to the right. This is a seed bank. It essentially takes the seeds down to like really low temperatures where it would like stop all of their cellular processes, kind of freezes them essentially, so that we could save them and then transplant them later. The stored material inside the seed is called germplasm. Germplasm is essentially the type of material that can give rise to a new organism. Like the germ cells are the ones that undergo meiosis, for example. But a seed is already an embryo, so it's already been fertilized, and it would store the germplasm inside of the seed, and then you'd be able to plant the seeds, unfreeze them, and plant them back into their native habitat to help conserve biodiversity that way. There's also similar programs for animals where we can captively take animals to another location, breed them there, and then hopefully re-release them back into their native habitat. Zoos also are a good example of an off-site mechanism, and a lot of times zoos are doing this. They are breeding organisms there and then re-releasing them or reintroducing them back into the wild when they're ready. They also help study organisms. Zoos help to help injured organisms. They usually have like a pretty good medical facility on site that they can bring injured animals to. So zoos are much more than just a place to go look at an animal, right? They give a lot of important information. So when you're at a zoo, you should be learning, learning, learning. That's the whole point of a zoo. And on top of that, they're all about conservation. So all the money that you give to the zoo typically goes towards conservation efforts, saving animals in the wild that are endangered. So really, it's like a donation when you go to a zoo. You get to donate money to a great cause, and you get to also see the animals and learn about the animals. And a botanical garden would be similar too. It would just be for plants. You can also store the germplasm for animals as well. So you would maybe store sperm and egg, freeze them, and then fertilize them in vitro later, transplant that into organism, and hopefully help to, make more of those organisms if we needed to breed more, if the numbers were super low, things like that. Biogeography is a term that we learned about in BioH, and we did re-talk about it at the beginning of this year when we did the evolution unit. What biogeography means is it's the geographic distribution of plants and animals around the world. So it's like, where do we find them? And we talked about this in regards to evolution because we talked about when land masses separated and took animals with them. And so there may be animals or plants that are only found in a particular area, like only found in New Zealand, simply because of biogeography, not because other animals would be unfit to live there. So that's how we talked about the term in regards to evolution, but you can use it on a smaller scale too, where the distribution of plants and animals just within an ecosystem can be considered. And that's going to influence the diversity of that ecosystem because there are parts of the ecosystem that are different. They don't house as many animals there or as many plants there versus parts of that ecosystem that would be more diverse. Usually the center area is more diverse and the edges tend to be different and therefore less diverse. So when coming up with a nature reserve in order to conserve biodiversity, we would want to look at the biogeographical features, like what are the needs of those organisms, where are they found within that particular ecosystem, and then how can we accommodate those organisms. Typically, a larger reserve is more effective than a smaller reserve. There's more space, more organisms can occupy those areas, there's more available niches, and it's less likely to be taken out by some type of random event like wildfire or flooding or a storm, something like that, because the population is bigger. Shape also makes a big difference. Again, near the edges does tend to be less diverse in regards to the organisms that live there. And so minimizing the edges and maximizing the center area is important. We want less perimeter and more area. And so a circle would be better than a rectangle because the ratio of area to edge work would be different. But also a circle would be better than an oval for the same reason. Connected nature reserves tend to be more effective than isolated ones, or just making sure that they're in a position, for example, where they could potentially get from one reserve to the next in an easier way would also help with that. Corridors are best if you can provide those, but sometimes that would be challenging and expensive to do, or sometimes impossible to do. But if you look at this little picture on the right, it has reserves that are better compared to the one right next to them. Those ones are worse. So the first one is like big versus small, right? Bigger is better than small. If you come down a little farther, you can see how they're clustered also matters, right? So this is clustered in a more effective way than these reserves. This is clustered in a more effective way compared to a straight line without corridors because, how does the middle one, or how does this one get all the way over here? It would have to go through the middle one, whereas that's not possible. It doesn't have to happen that way here. And then corridors are better than no corridors. Here shows you a corridor that is completed. It was in Singapore. Singapore has this huge master highway, a super highway that they put in because of their increasing population. And this super highway ended up dividing a forest into 2 forest regions. And they were having a lot of complications with organisms trying to cross the freeway and then getting hit by cars, which of course is dangerous for organisms and dangerous for people. So what they did was they built a corridor. So you can see like overall what a corridor is. It looks like nature, right? But it's artificially made, and they do try to make it as natural as possible looking so that organisms will cross it. So it's like this bridge essentially that goes over their freeway. Here it is when they're trying to build it, and it's built now, and animals are crossing through the corridor. So they are recording that they're seeing animals cross through, and they are considering it a success at this point. There is a corridor being built over the 101. I'll show you a picture of that in just a second. This link, you can go to it if you want to, but I'm not going to click it right now. But essentially, it's for zoos, I think in Australia, in that area. And it's a collection of zoos. They're called Zoos Victoria, and they fight extinction. So their message is for conservation. So when you go to their website, you can read all about what they do. And so it's really important, I think, for students to understand that zoos are bigger than just a place to go see the animals. They collect money, and then they give grants to specific projects that help to conserve biodiversity in different areas of the world. And most zoos are like that. They have an overall much larger message. So this shows you the goal of building the corridor over the 101 freeway. It's near Agora, and we just started this project. It's a very expensive, time-consuming project, but overall, you know, that's what they're trying to do, eliminate the crossing of the wildlife across the 101 freeway. We've lost a lot of organisms, specifically mountain lions, because they've tried to cross the freeway and gotten hit by cars. And really, they're doing that because they're struggling to, you know, find enough food and where they currently are. But there's more food on the other side of the mountain range if they could just cross the freeway. And the reason they're out of food in the first place is because we've taken so much of their land for urbanization and businesses and agriculture, stuff like that. So there's a live camera that you can go to, savelacougars.org, and you can see in live time them working on this corridor. So I'm going to show you that next. Okay, so this is their website. You can click on all the links and read all about it. You can read about their funders and why they're doing this and all that stuff. And then when you scroll down, you will see, today. Today is March 1st. And so you can see it being built. It's right here, right? So this is what it looks like today. And so we can track the progress each day of how this is coming along. And so I think that's pretty neat. This is just another chart showing you better or worse, and this one has like the explanations next to it of why one might be better than the other. And so that's just like an extra way for you to see all that. Restoration by rewilding. This means that we are trying to restore an ecosystem back to its natural state. And so in rewilding, though, you want the ecosystem to make a comeback more naturally, so involving as little human interference as possible. It doesn't mean that there will be no interference, but the less interference, the better. Step one of rewilding is going to be to stop the human activities that were damaging that ecosystem in the first place. So whether this was like deforestation, agriculture, urbanization, whatever we're doing that's causing harm to that ecosystem, you'd have to stop that. And you'd have to return the land, you know, back to nature, meaning humans can't use it for that purpose anymore. And step two would be you may have to use interventions to undo past human activities because the damage was already done. And so if we've already done that damage, it will help speed up the process if we can undo any of it. So some of the things we might have to do with these interventions would be to redistribute native plant seeds. If there's not enough of the native plants anymore because we cleared it, we'd need to bring in seeds of those native plants and plant them, so hopefully they could germinate and grow. If they're missing their, keystone species or apex predators, then reintroduction of those may be needed. If the ecosystems are fragmented, then we may have to help connect them by providing corridors and such. And then if we have released invasive species into those areas, then being able to control those invasive species by removal or killing them may be necessary. There has been some success stories in restoration by rewilding, and this one mentioned here, Hiniwai Reservation in New Zealand, is a specific IB standard. So you do need to know this specific example. But this used to be farmland, and it was, we had cleared the land and used it for farming, and then the farmland was given back to nature. It's actually privately owned, so they returned it back to nature, and when they committed to doing that, over time, it did actually return back to a forest, and so that's really exciting. Minimal human interference was done, except to control the alien mammal species that were there that were causing harm to that particular ecosystem. But other than that, it has done a really good job of making a comeback really just in a more natural state. That doesn't mean it's not in harm's way for other issues. It still is. It's still at risk for climate change causing issues in that particular area. So global warming is still very much affecting that ecosystem and other ecosystems, but at least it's not at risk for direct human interferences, like clearing the land, for example. So here is kind of like before and after pictures. So before the restoration was completed, and then now you can see that it's forest. And then here's like an up close picture as well. It's been cleared in this one, and now it's nice and green and lush and converting back to forest. We already know that too much carbon dioxide is being output into the environment, and this is a problem that's very hard to fix because CO2 is so abundant and lasts for such a long time, and there is so much industrialization leading to that. But sequestering carbon would be a way to remove carbon from the atmosphere. And so there are approaches that we're doing in order to sequester more carbon, to remove more CO2 from the atmosphere and store it up in a sink, right? In some kind of sink. And so here are some things that are being done. Afforestation means that we are planting trees in areas where they currently are not planted. So this would be like a new area that didn't have plants like this before. And now we're going to plant the trees in hopes that those trees will, grow big, be successful, and then remove CO2 from the atmosphere and lock it up in their wood. That's called afforestation. There are many countries out there that have committed to a certain number of trees being planted through afforestation in a certain chunk of time. So they may be saying things like, within the next 5 years, our country will plant 5 billion trees in areas where they've never been before. And so this really shows the, ecology community coming together to try and reverse some of the issues that we have from climate change. Reforestation is the same thing as forest regeneration, and this is where we are trying to bring forests back that have been depleted. So forests that have been cleared, forests that have burned, whatever the issue is, where it's no longer a forest, or at least not a balanced forest anymore, we are replanting trees there, either small trees or seeds, in hopes that, those trees will do the same thing that afforestation would do. The difference between the two is that this has already been a forest in the past. And then restoration of peat-forming wetlands. So we already know that peat sequesters a lot of carbon because it can hold that carbon and then later be used as a fossil fuel. But the problem is in areas where we normally would have peat form, we have drained the water from those areas, and so now they're not getting the same amount of peat actually forming there because it's too dry. Remember, peat requires like waterlogged and anaerobic, sometimes acidic conditions, and by damming up the water or draining that area, diverting the water, we have dried out those wetlands, typically for farming, and we want to restore those water levels and remove any blockages that we've done to drain or divert the water, and then hopefully reestablish some of the native species. And then once it's back to wetland, we can sequester carbon through the formation of peat. Prioritizing species for conservation can be very controversial. There are a lot of species out there that need conservation efforts, and it's hard to choose which ones we will target for the most help. There is a project, organization is a better word, that does this, that makes these tough choices, and they are called the Edge of Existence Project. You do need to know the details of the Edge of Existence Project. This is an IB standard. They ultimately have to decide which species are the most worthy of conservation efforts. They're all worthy of it, but how do we choose which ones to spend most of our time, effort, money, energy into? So they typically use two criteria. The first criteria is, does the species have few or no close relatives, and therefore it is a member of a very small clade? That would mean that there's not a lot of organisms left or species left that are similar to them. And so losing a small clade like that would be very sad, because you're losing biodiversity that you can't replace. There's nothing else like it, or not a lot of organisms like it. And that's not true of larger clades. Larger clades, there's typically a lot of organisms that are very similar to them. And so, prioritizing small clades is something that they will do. And this means, are they evolutionarily distinct? And that is what the ED and EDGE stands for. Are they evolutionary distinct? There's no one left like them in their clade, or not very many species evolutionarily similar to them. That makes them important. The second thing that they look at is, are they globally endangered? And so that's the GE of EDGE, evolutionary, distinct, and globally endangered. So this means, is the actual species, the overall species, in danger of extinction because all of its remaining populations are threatened? And this isn't always true. Sometimes you have, one particular population that's highly threatened by extinction, but then they are thriving in other populations elsewhere. So if we are close to losing all of them globally, that would mean they are under much greater threat. And there are red lists that will, tell you how endangered an organism is. Like, are they vulnerable? Are they threatened? Are they critically endangered? So these are the criteria that they will look at. Sustainability of resources is something that's important to think about, because there are many natural resources that are being used by humans in an unsustainable way. These are things that, if we keep using them at the same rate that we are currently using them at, this happens to be a faster rate than it's able to be replaced by natural processes, which means we are likely to run out at some point, because these things are finite, right? They're not infinite, they are finite. There is a finite amount, it's not limitless. And so, for example, how fast we're using fossil fuels and phosphates when we mine for them is unsustainable. At some point, we could potentially run out of resources, and this would be a problem. So the reason why fossil fuels would be, and phosphates honestly, would be, oops, sorry, hold on. Okay, back on track. So the reason why fossil fuels and phosphates are considered unsustainable is because they take a long time to reform. So for example, fossil fuels like coal and oil, these things take a long time, millions of years, hundreds of millions of years sometime to form. And so we can't wait that long to replace these resources. That's what makes them non-renewable. Or phosphates. We actually don't know how much phosphates are left in our phosphate reserves, but we mine for phosphates so that we can use the phosphates for fertilizers. And geological processes are slow, right? So to put that phosphate back into the rock so we can continue to mine for it, that takes a really long time. We'd have to wait for heat and compaction and geologic upheaval to bring those phosphates back to surface so we can remine for them. It just takes a long time. And so it's not sustainable how fast we're using these resources. At some point we could run out. We can learn a lot on how to live a sustainable lifestyle if we look at natural ecosystems that are successfully sustainable. In order for an ecosystem to be sustainable, the three things below would have to be met. One, they have to have plenty of nutrients available. We have to get the nutrients into the plants and then cycled through the food chains and then recycled back to the plants. Nutrient availability is important because and it is renewable because they can continue to recycle nutrients indefinitely if they have this balance, right? So we depend on the decomposers to break down the dead and detritus material in these natural ecosystems, return those nutrients back to the plants in the soil, the plants uptake them, and then they enter the food chain once again, helping to repeat that cycle. Detoxification of waste products is important. We cannot have waste just build up within that ecosystem because waste can be toxic to organisms. And so one thing that happens to help get rid of these wastes or detoxify the waste is that the waste of one organism can sometimes be exploited or used by another organism. For example, the waste from urine or feces is high in ammonia, and ammonia can be toxic to organisms, but there are bacteria in the soil that can take that ammonia and convert it into a different form of nitrogen so that the plants can take that in. And not only does it turn it into a form that's more usable by plants, but in addition to that, it also eliminates that ammonia in the soil that could be toxic to other organisms. So that is important. And then energy availability. Remember, energy only flows in one direction, comes in the ecosystem, usually as sunlight enters the plants, enters through the food chain, and is eventually lost as heat from the ecosystem completely. Energy cannot be recycled. So that means there always has to be a constant supply of energy. And again, most ecosystems are going to use the sun for energy. So we've seen the sun's energy actually limiting ecosystems in the past. For example, when a volcano erupts, it often puts a lot of dust particles into the air, and then the dust particles are going to limit light within that area. They block the light to the organisms that need it, and then the plants don't have enough light for photosynthesis. Less primary productivity means less food that can be transferred through the food chain. And so temporarily we would see those ecosystems not do well, not be sustainable. And then hopefully when the dust settles and they can get more light, it usually does revert back to its original state. Sustainable harvesting is also an issue. For plants, we need to make sure we leave enough seeds when we do harvest the seeds of these plants to grow into new plants, right? We cannot harvest at a rate where we're taking more then nature can replace. Because at that point, we're not doing sustainable harvesting. And so we have seen unsustainable harvesting in a lot of locations. A specific example that you need to know is in Brazil. We harvest Brazil nuts too much. We over harvest them, and we don't leave enough of these nuts in the Amazon rainforest for them to replace themselves. And so this is unsustainable. In addition to that, we also log for their wood, and that also means less seeds are being left to repopulate that area. And so again, this amount of harvesting, whether it's the seeds directly or the trees themselves, is unsustainable. We also have sustainable harvesting that we need to consider for animals, right? So hunting, fishing, we need to do this in a sustainable and responsible way. Again, we cannot harvest these organisms faster than they can be replaced. This is called maximum sustainable yield. This term applies to plants as well, maximum sustainable yield. We cannot harvest beyond maximum sustainable yield, otherwise we'll deplete the resources and run out. And so you see this a lot in the fishing industry. You hear this term a lot in the fishing industry, where we have overfished some populations, and this has caused not only ecosystem losses, but also economical losses as well. The fishing industry is a huge industry. The example in the IB curriculum is the cod population in the North Atlantic Ocean has been overfished. And so there's not enough fish anymore. This is causing us to fish down the food chain, which means now we're catching smaller and smaller fish. And this is even further limiting the cod population. So there's some graphs up here. We've talked about maximum sustainable yield in a previous chapter as well. We looked at it from a logistical growth graph point of view right here, right? So the best time to remove organisms from their population is going to be when they are in exponential growth, because that is the rate at which they are replacing their organisms the fastest. So if we can pull organisms then, so fish for them at that time, then they can replace them as we're removing them. And so this will help to stabilize the population so that we can keep the fishing industry going for a lot longer. And usually that amount, if you were going to quantify maximum sustainable yield, it's typically between zero population and the carrying capacity. So if the carrying capacity was 1,000, then the maximum sustainable yield is usually around 500 individuals, halfway between, halfway to the carrying capacity. If you look at this graph, right, so we have slow growth happening here in the lag phase. And if we pull organisms at that time when they're not growing as quickly in population size, then you're going to see the population size drop. And the same would be true up here when we pull organisms during the transitional phase, or even after that at carrying capacity. Then again, we're going to see the population size drop because they're not able to replace them as fast as we are removing them. Here's a different graph over here looking at maximum sustainable yield. And this graph kind of helps you see it from both an ecological and an economical perspective. So I want you to pause the video and think about, like, why would it be a problem to underfish versus overfish within a particular ecosystem, both from an ecological perspective and from an economical perspective. So again, we want to be near this maximum sustainable yield right here, because this is when organisms can replace what we have fished for the fastest, and therefore keep sustainable population sizes. And that's good for the ecology of that area, but it's also good for the economy because it means the fishing industry will last longer. The fishermen can fish, and then there's still enough fish left for the fish to repopulate for next fishing season. If we underutilize that, then that means that we're not pulling enough fish from the ecosystem. If you don't pull enough fish from the ecosystem, then the fish can be overcrowded. And if they get overcrowded, there is always a potential for disease to spread easily between the organisms, should they get a disease. But from an economical standpoint, this is also bad because we're leaving more fish than we need to, which means that's less food to put on the tables for people, and that's less jobs for fishermen who may need to fish, right? So we do want to find this balance. And then if we overfish on the flip side, this is also a problem, right? Because overfishing means you haven't left enough fish for the fish population to repopulate. And if that's true, then sure, you'll have this nice boom one season in the fishing industry, but then after that, it's going to kill the fishing industry. There's not going to be enough fish to fish it for anymore. And so people are going to lose jobs, right? So overfishing is also a problem because it means a loss of jobs and a loss of food for a lot of people. So we need to harvest responsibly, whether it's fish, other animals, or plants. Agriculture also has many factors that affect its sustainability, especially intensive agriculture. Intensive agriculture means you're putting a lot of inputs and a lot of effort into your crops, because this ultimately will lead to high levels of outputs, high yields, and then that should lead to more food being harvested and more money for the farmer. The problem is we are overusing resources in this process that are finite. So this is going to go through some of the problems in intensive farming. One is tillage. Tillage means that they're loosening up the soil. And this is usually done with like a tilling machine. It doesn't have to be a machine that is powered. It could just be a handheld tiller where you just literally push it with your hands, and then it has these like rotors that kind of spin around in the soil, grab the soil, and help to loosen it. Tillage is important because if the land is hard and compacted and you don't till it up first, then you're not going to be able to dig down to plant the seeds, and the roots are going to have a really hard time also growing within the hard land. So we do typically have to till the soil up before planting. However, loose soil promotes erosion, because if it's looser, then when wind comes or water comes, it's going to be a lot easier for this loose soil to be picked up by wind, by water, and then erode away, be carried away. And so if we are tilling, loosening soil at a faster rate, then it can, solidify back and make new soil, then that would be unsustainable. Mechanical tillage is the same concept, except you're using a machine like a tractor. And this tractor requires gas. And so it could be diesel, it could be other types of gasoline, but either way, these giant tractors, these giant tilling machines require us to use fossil fuels, and that releases emissions when they are burned. And so this leads to a high carbon footprint, which of course negatively impacts the environment. Monoculture crops are when farmers replant the same type of crop and only one type of crop year after year after year. And the problem with this is that it promotes the same types of weeds or pests, like insects or other types of pests, to come in and cause damage to the crops. It would just intensify because they, get used to having that same type of crop. So the same type of weed could come in and compete with it. Or the same type of, insect can come in and just devastate the whole crop. And so the problem with this is it increases the use of what's called agrochemicals, which are going to be chemicals used in agriculture. So pesticides, herbicides, insecticides, and these cause a variety of problems. One of the problems being runoff, right? If the crops are poorly drained and then these chemicals sit on top, they can run off and cause damage to other locations where they weren't intended to. And in addition to that, they can cause harm to the organisms that are native to that particular area as well. Nutrient depletion is going to be of the soil at the farmland, and this happens for a couple of reasons. One would be runoff. So because of the fertilizers that were used there, the soils are enriched. But then if you have poorly drained crops, then that will result in nutrient-rich runoff, which results in eutrophication in nearby bodies of water. So that's one problem for this due to leaching. And then another problem is when we harvest the crops, it removes the nutrients from the soil. And in a natural ecosystem, when plants or animals die, decomposers are going to break them down and return the nutrients back to the soil. But in crop harvesting, that won't happen. Instead, we remove the crops and they get physically taken off that land and to another location where they will be consumed by people. So harvesting crops means that those nutrients never get returned to the soil. Instead, it just leaves the soil depleted of nutrients. That's why year after year, farmers have to replenish those nutrients with fertilizers. And so fertilizers are a problem because, number one, making fertilizers in factories releases emissions, and number two, one of the fertilizers that they will always use for plants need this particular nutrient, is phosphate. And remember, we have to mine for phosphate, and phosphate is finite. So there will be a time where we run out of phosphate if we overmine for it. And that's going to be a problem, because if we don't have enough phosphate for fertilizers, then we don't have enough fertilizers for crops, which means we don't have enough food for people. And so scientists do think that at some point, potentially, we could run out of phosphates, and it could lead to famine, which is starvation, which could lead to death of a lot of people. And they don't estimate this being all that far off. Some scientists estimate this as being as in the near future as like 50 to 100 years from now. Other scientists estimate it much further out than that, but the issue is we don't know. We don't know how much phosphorus is left, but we do agree that it is a problem, that it's finite and we are overusing it. That is the last slide for our Part 8 notes. We are done with ecology.